Hi, everybody. Thanks for being here this evening. Let's start by talking a bit about climate change. So we all know at this point that the environment is in crisis. We hear talk of global warming every day. We also know that our own production and consumption practices play a significant role in causing current climate change. And we are beginning to see the effects. The increasing acidification of the ocean, which has already resulted in the death of coral reefs and the ecosystems they support. Sea levels have begun rising, threatening numerous coastal populations across the globe. A number of years ago, the government of the Maldives even hosted a cabinet meeting underwater to try to bring awareness to this issue. And we have seen the beginnings of a mass extinction of species in recent times, with many more under threat. But often the focus is on a particular environmental problem and what can be done to solve it. We either hear talk of institutional regulations intended to curb the effects of some particular practice, such as the transition to alternative energy sources like solar or wind, or we are told that what we as individuals can do to play our part, for instance, the emphasis on recycling, using public transport instead of a car, and so on. There's nothing wrong with doing these things. In fact, we should be doing these things, but the danger comes when these are posed as even potentially adequate solutions to the current climate crisis. The heart of the problem lies in the logic of contemporary society, the very way of thinking behind our contemporary way of life. There are a few key elements I want to focus on in particular. The first is growth. The logic of modern capitalist society is oriented towards growth at all costs. In fact, growth itself is the end for which the rest of our activities are simply means. We see this present at every level, from the individual who emphasizes accumulation and personal assets, the company that is dedicated to maximizing profit margin, up to the nation that seeks to increase its GDP, or the value of goods present in its economy every year. The danger here is that growth is pursued endlessly for its own sake. But there is no such thing as limitless growth. In the natural world, we see organisms grow so that they can reach a particular state of maturity, which constitutes their fully realized self. Human society, on the other hand, is viewed as something that should continually increase in scale and scope. Yet the larger and more complex an organism becomes, the more energy it requires and the more taxing it is on the environment. We are fast headed towards a critical point, a point where the physical world is actually unable to support further growth. And this brings us to the second point, resources. Human society has always shaped its environment through the use of technology. Resources are just those material goods that are made into new technologies or that can be made into products for human society through the use of technology. Resources in this general sense represent goods that have the potential to be transformed into something else, some kind of product. But this also means that resources themselves are actually meaningless. The value of a resource comes from what it can be made into, not what it is. With the historical development of technology, particularly through the Industrial Revolution, we have steadily increased our power to manipulate and control the physical world. And via the logic of growth, our use of resources has correspondingly increased. A consequence has been the transformation of nearly everything into a resource. Nothing has any value except insofar as it facilitates growth and consumption. Trees are no longer living organisms, but lumber, which can be transformed into any number of products. And even further, human beings are no longer simply human, but rather human resources, a source of labor power that only has value to the extent that it can contribute to economic growth. The above 2 points signify a crucial aspect of modern logic, the inversion of means and ends. In times past, material goods and wealth was a means to an end, where the end for an individual is a good life of comfort and leisure, and the end for a society is the health and well-being of its population. In this logic, however, wealth and growth become the ends themselves, towards which all effort and resources are directed. That is no good life, because it is not a life at all. Life is not defined by growth. Rather, growth is a necessary process that allows for the living of a life. Growth is a mechanism, and everything in its path, living or not, becomes a cog in its operation. This is the problem with these so-called solutions to the environmental crisis offered in the mainstream rhetoric. They do nothing to address the underlying causes of the crisis itself. It doesn't matter if we change to an alternative source of energy if we continue to utilize it to facilitate economic expansion and resource expenditure. It doesn't matter if populations become more eco-friendly if they will continue to be reserves of labor power for the continued growth of the modern machine. We will soon reach a time when the essential resources we need to survive, food supplies and water, become all but inaccessible to the majority of the population. In fact, we already see this happening, though we tend to feel its effects less in the first world. We will see wars for territory and access to resources, and ultimately the bursting of the bubble of modern society. If we don't change our way of thinking about the world, the logic by which we organize our society and determine what ends we aim to achieve, the wound of environmental degradation will continue to fester under the heap of plasters we continue to place upon it. By the time we really feel the effects of our unsustainable practices, it will be too late. But before we can really begin to ask what sorts of changes in our way of thinking and living is required, we need to investigate the source of the current environmental situation and the social practices responsible for producing it. Essentially, our current relationship to the environment paints a picture of domination. The development of technology represents the development of our power to influence and manipulate the natural world, and we've used this power to exploit what we find for our own ends. Yet this logic of domination does not begin with the exploitation of the environment. A number of scholars have argued that before humanity learned to dominate the environment, they first learned to dominate one another, specifically with the development of hierarchy. The old dominate the young in the form of subservience to elder leadership, or gerontocracy. The man dominates woman with the creation of a gendered division of labor, resulting in patriarchy. And those who have come to dominate those who do not have, in the development of the first form of economic exploitation. It is only with the development of the logic of domination within society that humanity began to recognize nature as something that could be exploited. Before this development, human society lived in a symbiotic relationship with the environment. Part of the reason for this was necessity. Because early societies did not possess the same means to alter and influence their environment that we do now, nature represented a force over and above human power. But this also followed a reverence for nature, not just its power, but the manner in which it operates. The fact that it is both competitive and cooperative, that unified ecosystems flourish in diversity. Early humans held that knowledge came from observing nature, not with the aim of understanding it in order to be able to manipulate it or predict outcomes of events, though that was an important aspect, but rather with the intention of imitating nature or modeling one's own way of life after the ebb and flow of natural processes. This is significant because it reflects a particular way early human society understood themselves in relation to nature. They did not view themselves as separated from the natural world or as some distinct entity placed within it, but rather as a part of the world, and human society as an extension of the organization of natural systems. The aim of these early societies was to provide the means for a good life for its inhabitants. They encouraged growth and development so that they may realize their potential as human beings. Humanity as we know it today, however, is not just a biological phenomenon, but is rather the product of the emergence and development of interpersonal structures. Humanity could not exist without the establishment of a collective way of life that provides the means for the emergence of art, culture, language, self-expression, and self-discovery. This is why it is said that human beings are social animals. The elements responsible for defining them as humans, rather than as hairless monkeys, are only achievable in a collective social setting. That is why the aim of labor in early society was the society itself. They labored to live a better life and to give thanks to the divine forces responsible for their existence. Society existed as an end in itself, the culmination of a way of life that could allow one to thrive and flourish as a human being. However, as hierarchy began to permeate every aspect of society, and the logic of domination played an increasingly central role in the organization of the structures of everyday life, the aims of society began to shift. Power began to serve the end of individuals who possessed it, as distinct from the consideration of the society at large. The consequence is a turning inward of concern. The individual self becomes an end for itself, not as a part of a healthy and flourishing sociality, but as an isolated atom of wants and desires, distinct from everything around it, that can only be successful at the expense of its environment or other surrounding entities. The development of the logic of domination represents a shift in values, the consequence of which we have felt ever since. Every social ailment we struggle against, from sexism, racism, and xenophobia to the exploitation of human and natural resources, has its root in the logic of domination. It is this logic we must seek to undo, to create a fundamentally different system of values that result in a different social formation and a different way of living everyday life. Now, as you can gather from the title of this talk, I believe that socialism represents the possibility of such an alternative social formation. By this, I mean socialism in its more purely linguistic sense, where the end towards which the society is aimed is the development and betterment of itself, for the realization and well-being of its population. However, we must tread warily here when searching for alternatives, for the logic of domination is deeply rooted in the structures of society, and there is a substantial risk of merely dressing up the same logic in different clothing if we are not careful. To exemplify this point, I want to briefly discuss the concept of nature in the thought of Marx. Marx conceived of nature as the realm of necessity, where operations and activity is determined by material need. This is distinct from human society, or the realm of freedom, where humanity is afforded the means to begin to realize itself with the emergence of art, mythology, and culture. This is why, for Marx, capitalism is a necessary precondition for communism, because it is the social formation which realizes the ultimate ability of humanity to freely be itself against the forces of nature, by institutionalizing the human ability to manipulate its environment for its own purposes in the means of production. The advent of communism, for Marx, is the undoing of hierarchy within the sphere of production, placing the power to produce in the hands of laborers themselves. The underlying logic of modernity, however, with its conception of the human as something distinct from nature, and moreover the conception of nature as a reserve of resources there to be utilized for the expansion of human society, remains in this too simplistic yet widely held understanding of Marxism. Now, Marx wrote at the crux of the Industrial Revolution. He saw the power of the modern factory and described its emergence out of the material development of culture. From our current historical position, however, we must recognize the factory itself as a part of the problem. The factory is built and can only function on a logic of technological domination and efficient production. For Marx, nature is still a realm distinct from the human and remains conceived as a realm of utility. In such mechanistic thinking, our relationship to nature remains one of utility, and the robustness of ecosystems is a secondary consideration to the material goods that can be produced from resources extracted from it. What we need now is not to change control of the means of production, or even to reform production practices. Ultimately, what is required is a fundamentally new relationship to the activity of production itself, beginning with reevaluating the reason why we produce in the first place. Given the extent to which technology has developed and the capabilities of society have altered, it is as pointless to talk about returning to some romantic image of a past society as it is to discuss piecemeal reform as a solution to the systemic problem of domination. What we need is a new thinking, which departs from our current understanding of the natural world and our technological ability to influence it, and which additionally maintains the ideals of humanity as an end in itself. Such a project is certainly easier said than done, but I want to talk here about one notion in particular, referred to by environmental sociologist Murray Bookchin as complementarity. This is essentially the idea that a sustainable or ecological society is the one that complements its environment rather than conflicts with it. The idea of complementarity comes from observing natural systems and understanding what makes them successful. Often we cast nature as a realm of pure competition, where only the so-called fittest survive. The extent to which this is true, however, is often overblown, presumably to ideologically justify our own society of competition. What this overlooks is that fitness does not mean strength or power. Rather, it refers to niches that exist in the landscape of a particular environment. An organism can survive and flourish not by being the strongest and eliminating competition, but by filling a role needed by another organism in its environment. For instance, as an example, sharks are one of the preeminent predators in their environment. But one of the reasons they are so successful is because they are often flanked by pilot fish, which swim around their gills and mouth, eating parasites that are potentially harmful to the shark. Because the sharks know the pilot fish perform this role, it does not consume them, and in return the pilot fish can flourish because they have access to free food and protection from other organisms that may potentially prey on them. What makes each organism successful in this instance is the shortcomings of the other, and the fact that they can aid one another to realize a more robust existence for themselves. The natural world is filled with such examples of complementarity. It is often not intentional, but rather a product of evolutionary forces that have resulted in particular organisms whose essential activity benefits another in some way. We now know that the most stable and resilient ecosystems are the ones with the greatest biodiversity, precisely because if something happens to one of the species, the entire system can respond and adapt to continue to survive and flourish. This is perhaps one of the biggest consequences of industrial monocultural farming. We facilitate the survival of those organisms which best suit our own needs and exhaust the nutrients of a particular ecosystem in the service of this one crop. This comes at the expense of access by other organisms, which may not be as efficient in processing these nutrients, or may have been purposefully cleared away to make more room for this crop. This puts the entire ecosystem in a precarious position, and if something were to happen to that crop species, the system would lack the means to adapt and would ultimately collapse. The significance of this example is that we now know that we have this knowledge. We understand what makes a particular ecosystem healthy and what doesn't, what allows for the flourishing of the most diverse species and what doesn't. And this principle does not just apply to the natural world, but also the social world, for it is really nothing more than a particular type of ecosystem. The most robust society is the one that affords the flourishing of the greatest diversity, united in the service of a singular aim, which is the well-being of the ecosystem or society itself. We now possess the technological means to intervene in nature in the service of the well-being of the environment itself, and the knowledge to build a society that complements the environment it exists within, such that the flourishing of one allows the flourishing of the other. We can only hope to realize this goal by articulating an integrated picture of organic well-being and devoting ourselves to the construction of a fundamentally different way of life. I want to talk a bit about the significance of the environmental crisis. As I have cast it here, the struggle for an ecological society is essentially motivated by the same ideals as the revolutionary struggles of history. It is a struggle against hierarchy and oppression and for freedom and equality. However, the current environmental crisis gives our situation a qualitatively different character. The message is not that we should have a fundamental reorganization of society to realize a better life, but rather that it is imperative that we do so if we are to survive as a species. And the issue no longer just concerns us as humans, but potentially the survival of life itself on this planet. The urgency of this situation cannot be stressed enough. Natural systems are cycles, and they develop through feedback loops of the inputs from their constituents. In other words, nature develops over time by exchanges and interactions of what is in a particular environment. It is a snowball effect, where a particular action initiates the development of a process that continues to develop and expand through its own means, like a rock falling, starting an avalanche. This means that we have not yet seen the consequences of the pollution and degradation that has taken place up to this point. It is possible that if human society were to stop all pollution right now, it still may not be enough to prevent mass ecological collapse. Many climate scientists believe that we have not yet reached this tipping point, but that it is perhaps coming as soon as the next 10 to 15 years. There are 2 points I want all of you to leave here with. 1, radical politics is no longer an option or a dream, but a necessity. Humanity will not survive on its current path and requires a fundamental reorientation with respect to one another and the world as a whole. And 2, radical politics cannot be restricted to the realm of politics as we currently understand it, but must incorporate every aspect of how we actually live our life and conceive of ourselves in relation to the world. Now, much of what I have said here has been quite abstract concerning the structure of society itself, so I want to close with a brief discussion of what sorts of things we as individuals can do to aid in this struggle. I imagine that if you are here listening to this, you are already active and interested in radical politics. It is crucial that in the political activity we already engage in, we stress the need for an integrated, unified message that concerns the cause of the struggles that we face rather than their particular symptoms. Our activities must be taken in the name of realizing a genuine alternative, integrating the forces of various existing struggles to achieve the diversity required for sustainable alternative organization. More practically, perhaps what should be of primary concern when it comes to resources is independence. The needs of every village, town, and city are necessarily different, and their structures must be tailored to their particular environment. It is imperative that localities begin to take these matters into their own hands, to begin to build an alternative society through the formation of local councils and the establishment of citizen ordinances. The power of governance, must be taken back by the people themselves, and to do so, they must do all they can to assume control of the means of survival for themselves. A good example is the construction of alternative energy technologies at a local or human scale, with a simplicity that allows for usage and even repair with relatively little technical expertise. Murray Bookchin has written extensively on this topic, and I would recommend in particular his essay called Towards a Liberatory Technology, if you're interested in reading about that further. There are also numerous examples of movements dedicated to occupying urban spaces and converting them into community spaces, such as parks, recreation areas, and support centers. Cooperative projects aimed at localizing and collectivizing agricultural production and distribution have also shown success. For instance, in Detroit, a city ravaged by the decline of the car manufacturing industry, has seen a recent surge in urban agricultural initiatives, converting abandoned spaces into hubs of local agriculture production that can provide for its inhabitants. The majority of people are fed up with the system as it stands. The problem is that many don't believe an alternative is actually possible. They need to be shown an alternative is possible, and the only way to do so is to begin to materially construct it. The key point to take away for what we as individuals can do is that we must start incorporating and embodying these principles in our daily lives. A significant consequence of the society of domination is the isolation and atomization of human beings. In an era of unprecedented interconnection, we have never been so detached and isolated from one another in our daily lives. We are purposefully made to feel this way. When we believe we are isolated and powerless, we are, and the system has nothing to fear. We must combat this by building an authentic community, composed by a diversity of committed people oriented towards a common goal. This cannot be a struggle of ideological predispositions and party lines. It must be focused on the immediate way in which we actually live our daily life. As human beings, our power, our very being, stems from our social nature. Thus, we are powerless in isolation. Yet the power for reorganization remains latent, waiting to be realized by the emergence of a new community. We individuals are the citizen consumers responsible for keeping the modern machine running. If we can organize ourselves, commit to one another, we do actually have the power to bring the system to its knees. The problem is that the scale it now operates on is so large and daunting, it is almost incomprehensible. But the solution cannot be to attack it on its own terms, for the terms it sets are themselves the problem. Rather, we must seek to restore the power to the community, groups, collectives, and localities. The effects will be felt, and the more that they are, the greater the momentum that we gain. The end of our struggle is community, and so that must also be its starting point. By coming together and assuming the management of operations of our own local areas for ourselves, committing just small portions of our time to community building programs and sustainable living initiatives, we can actually realize piece by piece, community by community, what is ultimately almost unfathomable at levels of nations and states. Ultimately, a community functions on commitment and trust, and these are principles we can incorporate into almost every aspect of our daily lives and interactions. If we don't start with our goal, we will never reach it, and it has never been more imperative that we start doing so now.